This week, we are going to talk about environmental justice. So, a lot of our conversations have been leading up to this week's conversations. So, there is so much information and so many potential wonderful articles, books, podcasts, films that we could choose from. I chose four from environmental justice to represent this week. I don't want to necessarily make this seem like these four texts are canonical, meaning these are definitely the ones that you should be reading or listening to understand these issues. There's so many to potentially choose from. Aldo Leopold's The Land Ethic from the Sand County Almanac is particularly famous because it is from the beginning of the 20th century, or mid 20th century, I should say. So it is definitely one of the first texts to really start talking about environmental justice. So in that way, although Leopold is pretty famous in environmental literature, but otherwise, I simply picked texts that touch on environmental justice and some of the issues that we want to talk about. But I encourage you to look for more and to look from multiple perspectives. This course is short, so unfortunately I can only choose so many, but there are many, many great texts out there about environmental justice. So let's begin with Aldo Leopold, because that is by far the oldest text that I chose for this week. And so this quote comes from The Land Ethic. So this is part of his book, The Sand County Almanac. And in this part of the book, Aldo Leopold is making a case for something that has really never been made before, and that is a land ethic. So we know that, right? And this is his title. But one of his arguments is that we have, as human beings, made ethical commitments to each other. In some ways, we have made ethical commitments to different populations. We haven't always lived up to those commitments, but especially by 2023, I think that the majority of people understand that the majority of people should be able to live happy and free and safe lives. Again, as humans, we haven't done a great job of living up to this ethic, but it is articulated. In America, we have the Bill of Rights. In many other countries, of course, it is very clearly laid out what citizens owe one another, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, and what human rights people should have. So I think that's an important point. We have very clearly set out as a species at this point, what is a human right? What do we deserve to have in our lives? That's just indisputable. And so Aldo Leopold says, he acknowledges this as good, right? As important. But he says there is as yet no ethic dealing with man's relation to land and to the animals and plants which grow upon it. The land relation is still strictly economic, entailing privileges, but not obligations. So this is really important. This is the crux of his argument in 1949, saying that while we have an ethic toward one another, we have no ethic for the land or the plants or the animals that are also on that land. We think about our relationship as strictly economic. So we get privileges, we get things from the land, humans do, but we don't see any obligation to the land back. So we consider the environment, nature, the land as something that is for us and not that we are for it. So the plants, the animals, they serve us. The earth serves us. Nature serves us. And he's saying this is a problematic worldview. We need to have a land ethic. We need to articulate one where we have obligations to the land, back to the land. And so in the Sand County Almanac, Aldo Leopold tries to start articulating what this might look like. How do we make our land relation not strictly economic? What ethical dimensions should there be to the land? So now let's move forward, because the next three texts that we're going to be talking about have a very specific perspective of what a land ethic might mean. So Jilla Schneiderman, she writes from a feminist perspective, and she does it in a quite practical ways. So this isn't a very theoretical text. It's actually quite practical. She writes about how there are serious global environmental problems that have dire consequences for poor people, women, and children, particularly in developing countries. So again, this is a very practical viewpoint. It's also just true. So this part of it isn't an argument. She's just literally pointing out the fact that environmental degradation impacts women, children, and poor countries more, just based on power, because they are the folks with the least power. And so any environmental problem, spills, disasters, degradation, climate change, it all impacts poor people, women, and children, especially in developing countries, more. So building off of that just reality, there is also this theoretical perspective that is put forward by a feminist environmental justice perspective that states that the same sort of belief system that believes that there shouldn't be a land ethic, that it's economic, that we get privileges but not obligations, Aldo Leopold's point, is the same mentality, philosophy, ideology, politics, whatever you want to call it, that treats women so poorly. So the same sort of belief that we own it, that it's there to serve us, that it's subservient, that we can exploit it, we can dominate it. A feminist environmental justice perspective would say that's the sort of toxic masculinity or Western imperialist patriarchy, you might call it, that treats women that way, that believes women should be subservient, they can be exploited for a man's needs, that they can, entail privileges to the man, but there's no obligation back to the woman herself. That is the same mentality that is treated the environment so poorly, that again, I can exploit it, I can take what I need from the earth, then it's mine, you are subservient to me, I dominate you. And so it's the exact same, again, mentality, ideology, philosophy, politics that treats women poorly, that also treats the environment poorly. And then Jill S. Schneiderman's point in the article is basically just all these real ways this comes to be, because with this environmental exploitation comes the exploitation of these groups of people, including women, that have less power. Okay, so let's move on to the last two texts that also look at environmental justice from a particular perspective. So this one was a little bit painful. I would have included another book if I could, but again, only so much time. So what I chose to do is to have us listen to a review of the book called A Terrible Thing to Waste. And this book is about environmental racism, particularly for Black citizens, but also just disadvantaged groups in general. And so this discusses instances of environmental racism and how harmful environmental racism is in terms of people's health. So what happens when certain groups of people are exposed to toxic spills, chemicals, all of the things that in post-industrialism we're putting into the earth that impacts some people with less power more than other people. So the podcast itself, it's an interview with NPR, does a good overview of the book. And again, if you're interested in this, by all means, I suggest reading the book itself. And then the final podcast is from Ibram X. Kendi. He has an anti-racist podcast, so he covers lots of different topics. It's extremely good. I recommend it, of course. But for this class, for this week, we're focusing on repairing the past, returning native land. And so this podcast in particular discusses the land back movement and the environmental consequences of colonizing Indigenous people. So it gives a lot of great historical context, this podcast does, and to try to kind of look at human beings in terms of our evolution, our entire lifespan in terms of our species, and what has been constant and what has, I guess, worked, right? And so for much of the lifespan of the Homo sapien, what we now term indigenous folks had a certain relationship with the land. And that was the majority, again, of our lifespan as Homo sapiens, as human beings. And it's in relatively recent history that that has changed by extremes, right? Industrialism, colonialism, genocide, things like that. And so what has happened because of those things? Where are we now? And so repairing the past, returning native land talks about basically now what? You know, a lot of times in environmental conversations, a lot of the work is just pointing out the actual problems because people aren't always aware that there are such significant climate change or environmental issues happening. That's very much what Rachel Carson's Silent Spring did, was to simply point out the reality of the problems. Something like repairing the past, returning native land is now a response. Like, well, what do we do now? What do we do with this knowledge of our behavior as humans is not sustainable? We cannot continue this way. So what is perhaps an option rooted in environmental justice to return to some sort of sustainable lifestyle? And of course, in this podcast, it talks specifically about Indigenous populations and the environmental racism and just genocidal experience that they have dealt with since the colonization of North America is the focus of this podcast, but of course, the exploitation of Indigenous folks is true all around the world: North America, South America, Australia, and so forth. So this will give you a lot of background. And all of these texts, again, discuss environmental racism, discuss environmental justice, and will give you some familiarity and introduction to some of these concepts. And if there's one concept in particular, say, you know, Aldo Leopold trying to define what a land ethic might look like, or feminist environmental justice, or environmental racism, or the land back movement. If any of these issues are of interest to you, by all means, I recommend looking more into them because there's lots of resources.